Here again with James Roberson, we decided we are best friends, that we love one another.
Based upon the first video?
Yeah, based upon the first video. But in the last video, we made the case that if we're going to make disciples in North America, that we have to address the issue of race. We kind of focused in on the biblical side of that and some of the challenges that we face in doing that. And we kind of began to touch in on the idea of the challenges that we have, not of just understanding the theology, but applying that theology. Mm-hmm. During this time, really what I want to do is begin to apply it. You said that you were speaking to NAM, you were speaking to navigators, you've been speaking to leaders that are literally trying to say, all right, I get the theology, I'm all on, but I still don't know what to do. James, help me to do something. Give me my first steps. Like, let's talk a little bit about that. What has some of those conversations been? What have even been some of the questions that you've had had to ask or had to answer during that time?
Yeah, and I think just like anything, I mean, sometimes it takes a moment to just understand something, right? Before we move into a step. There may be some things that I need to think through. And so one of the first things that I do is I show a map. And on this map, it details within the country how different counties are actually indicating what is the majority culture or person in that county in America. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the map, it will show mainline Protestant, white. It'll show white evangelical. It'll show white Mormon. But when you look at the United States of America, though we have diversity in it, most Anglo-Americans or majority culture Americans operate in majority culture all day. And so what'll happen is they might have a Black friend or a Latino friend or an Asian friend, but rarely are they the minority amongst a different majority. And that does something mentally, because what that can do to you is have you believe that what you do is normal, i.e. the normalization of your culture or the standardization of your culture. We can slip into supremacy of seeing the way I do things is always right. And so one of the things that Tim Keller says is that white people tend to not realize they have a culture like a fish doesn't realize it's in water. So one of the things is realizing, like, when I am addressing an African American, I have to realize I actually don't need to begin to talk about everything Black that I've experienced. Just like it would be odd for me to go to my white brother and be like, yo, I know a white guy in Chicago I met one time. Because what we're in is, we're saying that majority culture needs to realize that minorities are always operating in their space. And they need to adapt to that. And so that's one of the things that I established early on. In
so what would you say to the pastor that he's pastoring a homogeneous church, a majority focused church, but he is in a context that is either changing, you know, the neighborhood's changing or whatever, and he's like, man, I have this homogeneous church in a multi-ethnic neighborhood, and I just don't know what to do. Like, but this is it. I don't know what to do. What are my first steps? And let me just kind of say, a lot of times when people ask me that question, the first thing that I begin to ask, I answer them. I said, well, have you ever been the minority? You know, and then I'll go in and says, if you haven't, have you ever taken a mission trip? And if you have taken a mission trip, you know, and you were the only one, and you remember all the insecurities that you had, like, will they accept my language? Will they, you know, like how I speak is kind of broken or whatever. The kids are laughing at you and all those insecurities that you have. Just embrace that moment. And then the answer is like, how does the gospel answer those questions, those insecurities? But then realize that the people that you're trying to minister to, they're in that for good. They're not. They can't switch it and take it and leave it. You're going back, but they're staying there. Like, what are some of the practical steps? What do you think about that? And what are some of the practical things that you would tell kind of a majority culture, a pastor specifically, or a leader of an organization that is trying to take that step?
So, a lot of the conversations that I've had around here, one, I think that's a beautiful analogy about mission trips and whatnot, and there is an exhausting nature to being in a different culture and constantly learning and whatnot. And we have to appreciate that when you come back home, you're like, I kind of understand what I'm doing right now. So we have to appreciate the exhausting nature of being in a different culture constantly. But I think one of the things, I forgot what I was saying. I'm sure we can cut that. One of the things that I just simply ask pastors is, honestly, going back to that first video, is like, have you read anything, and have you ever studied race? And many will say yes, and in terms of like Bible stuff. Yeah. Then I'll ask, are there any books that you've read on race? And many will say no. Okay. And then I'll go to the third step. Have you ever preached a sermon on race at your church? And
it's got to be no.
The majority of the time is no.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying you are seeing this as a problem, and you believe there's a biblical solution, but you're not adapting your communication to it. And I think the challenge with that is that if you believe racism is a sin and you believe there's race problems, I have a problem with the fact that you wouldn't do this with adultery. Like, if you felt like there was adultery going on in your congregation, you would investigate it, communicate about it. And so I think that at the end of the day, like, we've got to put on blast this. We have to wed the idea of missions and diversity and race and justice. They're all blended in one, because we got to take our eyes off MSNBC, Fox News. And I believe that a lot of people, the reason why when we talk about race, immediately the word politics comes out, because I believe politics informs us more about race than biblical ideas. Yeah. So I think sometimes we're filled a little bit more with Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity than we are with Christ crucified. And so I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to turn a lot of that stuff off. Right? We have to turn those things down, and then we have to investigate, read, but then communicate from our pulpits that diversity matters. It doesn't matter if it's an all majority room. We have to just say, this is the end game. And we have to talk about it in lieu of missions, not just on Martin Luther King Sunday.
Right. And I think that's a huge point, because a lot of times when we talk about this, we kind of bring up the Revelation 7 passage like we did, but we talk about it from the vantage point of, that's a vision. You know, like, that's a vision that we're looking to, but it's not everybody's vision, especially now. We don't need to be everybody's vision. That's kind of a thing that would be good, but it's not necessary. So there's not a sense of urgency a lot of times in there. And I love what you said. The idea is, like, are we willing to call racism sin? Yeah. Are we willing to call anything that brings division in the body of Christ, that is causing that prejudice, racism, you know, discrimination, anything that, like, are we willing to call it sin? And are we willing to call it sin in the same way we adultery, fornication, you know, all those things? And I think that is critical, because you made an excellent point, because if we knew that there was fornication and adultery just running rampant, alcohol. You know, or alcohol running rampant in our churches, would we just be like, casually do it? But when it comes down to race issues, we always say, oh, it's gonna take time. Yeah. You know, give it time. These things don't turn over. So what do we say about kind of like, we can't have time? Because this was the same thing that they were telling Martin Luther King at the Birmingham jail, that give us time. Yeah. You're in a rush, you're in a hurry. So what would you say kind of to that pastor, again, who wants it, but is like, oh, but I can slow play it. I can take my time in getting it, because, you know, Brother Bob or so-and-so here, we're gonna have to nudge them along. I mean, how do you address that? Even on the flip side, a pastor that was saying, like, I wanna do it now, but I got Brother Sam or Brother John here who's more slow to embracing this. How do I get them to have that sense of urgency? What do I need to do? That's good.
So some conversations that I've had and some encouragements I've had is, what is biblical conviction? What is biblical conviction, right? What are the things that I'm convinced of in the scriptures, right? And so if I'm convinced that the Bible speaks to every nation, that we should be not just talking to every nation, discipling every nation, that's my end game, then if communicating racism and talking about every nation, those are two different lanes. So you can begin by just talking about every nation. You can begin by just, like, if we're not even talking about Revelation 7, if we're not breaking out the idea of every nation and talking about how we have a lot of different cultures and different people in our country, then we're really way back in the game in terms of missions, not just race. Right. But then the next step I believe, is then addressing the fact that, and I thought you did a great job of pulling out the idea, because a lot of people say, I don't know where to go to. But if we were to look at not just race, but culture, then the Jew and Gentile, the issue in Ephesians about the dividing wall being down, and now the Jew and Gentile can now not just communicate, but they can celebrate one another. Now it opens my eyes to opportunities to constantly communicate about this idea that we should be able to work through our differences. Yeah. So I think that that's just one from a biblical standpoint. But I think at the end of the day, there's going to be consequence to obedience. Yeah. I mean, there's going to be blessing, but there's always going to be consequence to obedience. And I think that no, race isn't the issue, but in New York, I can't talk about homosexuality, but I do. Yeah. And in fact, if I don't talk about homosexuality, people would question my fidelity to the scriptures. And I would liken homosexuality in the North, I would liken it to racism in the South. Yeah. And so, yes, I'm going to have people who in my theater community upset at me. Yes, I'll have people who may think something of me that I'm not. They'll call me, you know, they'll say I hate them. And that's equivalent to you're liberal, right? But I'm convinced. Yeah. I have a biblical conviction that God made men and women for each other. Yeah. And so I believe that in the South and for majority culture, I believe our convictions need to bleed out to the point of consequence and persecution. And I believe it may hurt, but I believe it'll be pure for our culture and for our church. Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And
you know, just to kind of wrap this up, I think it's really important for us to kind of, as a minority who is in majority culture, who's been trained in majority culture seminaries, take this a minute or so just to kind of, from your heart, don't, like, I'm not gonna ask you to speak on behalf of all black people, you know, but just from your own heart.
All black people, this for you.
Yeah, this share, like, what do you want them to hear? You know, what is it that is this kind of, what's your burden? Yeah. You know, why are you willing to leave your church to go to the South and to go to the places? Why are you SBC? Yeah. Just give us your burden in a minute or less.
In a minute or less. Wow, that was
all of it.
All my burden. So in 1968, my dad was the first African-American to graduate from Millsaps College. The first. He walked across the stage. He desegregated that school. My dad would go on to get a seminary degree. He would go on to get a PhD. And my dad would go on to read liberal theologians like James Cone, and my dad would go on to read about liberation theology. And as I grew in my relationship with Christ, I was, you know, amongst evangelicals, I was told essentially my dad was illegitimate because it was the L word, he's liberal. Yeah. But it was years later that I realized, well, coming to faith in New York City, the only schools he could have gone to were here, but at the time, being an African-American, he couldn't have gotten into the schools that I've been trained in anyway. And it broadened my horizons, not to say that the biblical convictions that we can have are different or anything along those lines. But what I'm saying is that for so many years, I came to the conclusion that I need to cut off things that my father was saying because I castigated or I ostracized him in this corner of, oh, you're liberal, oh, you're in the New York, oh, you. And then when I got to know him and hear his story and hear some of the challenges he's had, my heart expanded, my mind expanded. And that's my own dad. Yeah. And I believe that the reason why I go down here is because I think these are great people. Yeah. I think they love God, but I think they're missing an opportunity because Revelation 7 tells us they're going to win the nations. And I don't think we're in the game. Yeah. And I think when we cut people off and we think liberal or we think, you know, I'm not saying we don't keep our biblical convictions. I think we need to be slow to speak, quick to listen, and quick to listen to different nations.
Amen. I love it. And I think that's a great way to end the argument, even though we haven't solved it all, but a great way to solve it all. Yeah, well, we're stunned. We can drop the mic, but simply raising the question of if we're going to make disciples in North America, we have to address the issue of race.
We have to address it.
We. Yes. I love it. Yeah. I love the we. First person plural, not the me, not the you.
Not me and you.
Right, the us. We. Praise the Lord. Appreciate you, bro.